day, everyone. My name is Rohan Maraj, and I am going to be the moderator for today, the fourth annual Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day. And this year, our theme is on women and alcohol. And today we have three speakers with us. Professor Samuels is going to talk to us today on the regional burden, drivers, and consequence of alcohol use among women. Professor Samuels, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to talk about alcohol and women. And basically, I'm going to say, why do we have a concern? Talk a little bit about alcohol use and burden, and then particular issues of alcohol and women, and then finally look at a couple of policy options. So we know that non-communicable diseases makes up about 78% of all deaths in the Caribbean. And the diseases listed there, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and so on, have common risk factors. And these risk factors I will speak to in a second, but just to say that one of the issues around NCD deaths in the Caribbean is that they occur prematurely. So in most other countries, North America, for example, people would die of heart attack and stroke, say on average in their 60s, 70s, 80s. In the Caribbean, we are dying in our 30s, 40s, 50s on average. So we have a situation where you have countries with very high rates of premature mortality. And you can see on the graph that if you look at Guyana's men, for example, which are the top of the chart, and then you compare it with the United States, which is fifth from the bottom, Guyana's premature mortality rate is about 3 times the rate of premature mortality in the United States. So we are losing our people in their productive years. And the pathway is that we have the diseases in the red, right, that I mentioned a while ago, the diabetes and so on. You have intermediate risk factors or biological risk factors, so things like blood sugar, blood pressure, cholesterol, obesity. And then you have the common risk factors. And down here, you will see the harmful use of alcohol. And that really is where we are situating ourselves, in that harmful use of alcohol is one of the upstream risk factors for the main causes of death and premature death and disability in the region. We need to, Professor Lean was just saying the other day that we need to also focus on people who are living with disease and not just those who have died from disease. So yes, the mortality is important, but as important, people who have heart attacks and strokes and are still living with the sequelae, people who have diabetes and are managing it every day. Thousands and thousands of people with these illnesses that could have been prevented if we reduce the risk factors upstream. And to make the point also that our common risk factors are being driven by the underlying social and commercial determinants of health. The social determinants, the globalization, the urbanization, and so on. And let's not forget the commercial determinants of health, which is big companies that make profits from promoting and selling products harmful to human health. And alcohol is certainly one of those products. So alcohol use in the region, this is for the whole region of the Americas. In the Caribbean, we range between 6.3 and 9.6. So if you look at the little infographic on the side, you will see that that's about medium in the region of the Americas. Here we have alcohol deaths due to alcohol, and it's contributing about 5% of all deaths in the region. So 5 out of every 100 people who die are dying because of alcohol use. Harmful use of alcohol among adults, which is what we would call binge drinking. So more than 5 drinks on one occasion for men, more than 4 drinks on one occasion for women. The proportion in the region varies somewhat, but it's significant. Some men are up around 50%, and women 25% and less. Women on average do drink less than men. So here you just another graph to show that about 2/3 of men and about 40% of women drink between ages 15 and over, that they are current drinkers. And among those who are current drinkers, you see a big gender differential in terms of those who, the episodes of heavy episodic drinking. So that's the more than 5 drinks a day. So you will see the males, it's about half of all males who drink abuse alcohol. And about 1/5 of women who drink abuse alcohol. So what happens when you use and abuse alcohol? Let's see what is the definition of alcohol abuse. When you are abusing alcohol, you have certain symptoms. So example, failure to fulfill major obligations, physically hazardous situations, legal problems, you get arrested, disorderly conduct, social and interpersonal problems as well. And alcohol dependence or alcoholism, you would have withdrawal and tolerance. So if you stop drinking, you get, the shakes and you get, other physical manifestations. Tolerance, meaning that you can drink a lot of alcohol without becoming drunk, so to speak. And that you drink larger amounts and you drink over long periods than intended. You have a desire and you make efforts to cut down, but find you're not very successful. You spend an excessive amount of time getting or obtaining alcohol, give up certain activities, and continue to use despite the problems. So there you have a medical disease of addiction. So alcohol use disorder, alcoholism, alcohol addiction in women, it's a problem for both men and women, but it's a disease that affects women physically, emotionally, and psychologically differently from men because of how women metabolize alcohol. Women with alcohol problems are more at risk for heart disease. So if men and women drink the same amount, the women will get more heart disease from the alcohol. Also more cancer, more liver disorders. They suffer loss of personal relationships, abusive relationships, and higher rates of suicide than women who don't drink. So in terms of women, this chart is just showing you that for the same amount of consumption, women get a higher blood alcohol level. So if we go to the right-hand side of the chart and look in the final column, a woman who weighs 240 pounds who has had 3 drinks, her blood alcohol concentration is 0.6. But for a man, his is only 0.5. And he can actually go up to having 4 drinks before he gets to 0.6. So the women have run into problems with less number of drinks. This is because women absorb and metabolize alcohol differently from men. They experience greater impairment than men with equivalent doses of alcohol. And alcohol consumption in women is associated with a number of illnesses, including breast cancer. So Professor Anderson is going to speak much more about this, this area in terms of, alcohol causing 7 different types of cancer, bowel, breast, etc. If we go back and look at the breast cancer risk, we can see that the non-drinkers would get an average of 116 would be diagnosed in their lifetime out of every 1,000 women in the UK. Those who drink up to 3 units per day would get 5 extra cases. 3 to 6 units per day, 27 extra cases. So there's a huge jump between, drinking a couple of drinks a day, which does increase your risk. But really, when you start with the abuse, because remember we said 4 drinks a day was alcohol abuse. So once you get into that category, you are really increasing your risk, 27 out of 140, so that's like 20%. And more than it's 70 extra cases. So you can see there's a linear relationship between the amount of alcohol you drink each day and your risk of breast cancer. Despite that, the alcohol industry has actually used breast cancer as a marketing tool for alcohol. So we're selling alcohol that gives breast cancer as a celebration of breast cancer prevention. Yes. So here are some examples of, associating alcohol with breast cancer awareness and prevention. Amazing. Use of alcohol during pregnancy. Women who are or planning to be pregnant should not drink alcohol, 0, because it puts the unborn child at risk, and we're going to have a presentation on this later on. One of the reasons why women respond differently to alcohol than men is because estrogen causes alcohol to be more quickly absorbed into the bloodstream and slows down its metabolism out of the bloodstream. So it's absorbed quicker and it's excreted slower, so it spends longer time at higher rates in the body for the same amount of alcohol drinking. And also, alcohol can affect the menstrual cycle and affect a woman's fertility. In the areas of sexual and reproductive health, STDs and unplanned pregnancies are high among drinkers. The majority of rape involves either the perpetrator or the woman having been using alcohol. In domestic violence, wife battering and child abuse is associated with alcohol. Alcohol renders a man less capable of suppressing impulses towards violence, and women less able to perceive behavioral cues to potential violence and to protect themselves. And let's just remind ourselves that domestic violence is not 100% male battering females. There are in a minority of cases where women are the perpetrators, but the same alcohol story would apply where there's just less control on everybody's part. The harmful use to others from alcohol, the individual, the family, the work, and society. There's a health burden, there's a social burden, there's an economic burden, and injuries are a major area where there is burdens. Of course, being admitted to hospital, social costs of vandalism and alcohol, productivity loss, healthcare loss. Alcohol influences all of society. At the workplace, people being, hungover, coming to work, being present at work but not functioning well, what is called presenteeism, and of course absenteeism when they're ill and that kind of thing. So it's a wide-ranging problem and impact. Mental health and suicide among alcoholics. I mentioned earlier that alcoholic women are much more likely to attempt suicide than women who do not drink. And a study of suicides in New Mexico found that 2/3 of these women who committed suicide had alcohol or drugs in their blood at the time. Of course, we recognize that this could be a circular kind of thing because maybe you're depressed while you drink and, whatever, but the association is definitely there. Female victims of intimate violence often report that the offender had been drinking, and 4 out of 10 women in one study who committed violent acts were perceived as being under the influence at the time. Alcohol and aging. Women experience the damaging effect of chronic alcohol use more severely and more rapidly than men. It interferes with several processes, more extreme changes during menopause, and it also increases the risk of osteoporosis, resulting in greater bone loss and so greater risk of fractures as we age. When we want to assess women with alcohol use disorders, we should avoid stereotyping. They come from every social rank. We should try to interview without stigma and without trying to create guilt. Take the history, routine. You should ask open versus closed questions to allow the person to express themselves. Try to be non-judgmental. and focus on the problems that are being presented. And recall and remember that some of the assessment factors include, we should make sure to ask about isolation, early initiation of alcohol, history of neglect or abuse, tobacco use, and of course we have protective factors as well, which is when women have multiple roles, women who are married or in stable domestic relationships, and student athletes. Interesting. In terms of treatment, women who are alcoholic frequently have a different experience than males. It's generally diagnosed later in women than in men, and women are often more discreet about their abusive drinking and tend to drink alone more so than men. And because of employment, economic, and family factors, I mean, mommy cannot go away because she's the anchor of the home. So she, alcohol drinking or not, has to stay around to help us get through. So very often women will sacrifice themselves in that way and either have less access in some cultures or do not access, choose not to access for whatever reason in some other situations. So here we have this lady talking to her doctor, who says, okay, these are the recommended units of alcohol. Bleeding L, not much for a night out, is it? That's for the whole week. So concept of how much is too much to drink differs between different people. So let's now just talk a little bit about the policy options and how we should really manage this really very huge problem. So the WHO has recommended best buys. The WHO and PAHO in our region recommends tax increases to increase the price of alcohol and reduce demand, restricted access to retail alcohol, and bans on alcohol advertisement. Not surprisingly, the alcohol industry recommendations are for personal responsibility, so you should drink responsibly. So no mind I'm spending billions of dollars advertising to you to tell you to drink. I then turn around and say, well, you shouldn't drink, even though I'm telling you to drink. And of course, the alcohol industry suggests more research, which means delay, deny, and so on. So we need to recognize that, yes, the alcohol industry may want to talk with the health sector because they are being pushed, but in essence, they still want to make profit for their shareholders, which means they still want more people to drink more alcohol. So right now, the alcohol promotion is a big problem. The price, we are saying the price should be higher. The alcohol industry is busy dropping the price. So you have all kinds of promotions, 50% off alcohol, that kind of promotion, Monday to Friday, 5 to 7 p.m. So on your way home from work, pick up your 6 bottles of wine and whatever, half off, so you can get drunk tonight and come back and buy it more tomorrow. And then this is very popular in Caribbean too, where you have a low price for a lot of quantity. So you will say, 10 Banks beers for $5 or whatever the number is. And that, of course, is a price to increase consumption. So alcohol research, this guy says he needs cash for alcohol research, but that's not the kind of research that we are really referring to. In terms of alcohol research, most of the studies are on male subjects. Only 14% in one review of studies of alcoholism included women. Yet we recognize that there are different gender differences that we need to take into account in the research, gender differences such as body weight, body fat, and how alcohol is managed in the body, as we mentioned before. So we want to ban alcohol advertisement because it's just ridiculous. Look at this. Look at this pregnant woman with her drink. I mean, that's an ad, and there's just this sexuality being promoted and just drink more, win like a man. This is what it means to be a man. You have to be able to hold your liquor. Liquid panty remover is what this ad says. And there is advertising for alcohol in the Dominican Republic increased from 241 million in 2010 to 501 million in 2016. So they doubled their expenditure in 5 years. So when there are all these people talking about, well, let's do some health promotion and the health center should teach people these things and so on, the health center might have $10 for advertisement, but the alcohol industry has 500 million. So that is not at all a level playing field, and will never be. Governments will never have enough money to counter the alcohol industry in that way. Then alcohol is now being promoted as being healthy, antioxidant beer. I mean, it's just crazy. And yet here, this is a little tight, but in the middle of the middle column, we have a few results of exposure to alcohol advertisements. This is children's being exposed to alcohol advertisement, and you can see it's somewhere between 30 and 50%. So even the children are being indoctrinated from early on. The alcohol industry is promoting personal responsibility, and this is what personal responsibility looks like. You put a warning label at the top of the beer bottle, and you need a microscope to read it. We know you can't find it. The alcohol warnings do influence attention, recall, judgment, but it has no effect on behavior. The alcohol industry knows this, and this is why they are promoting warning labels and personal responsibility, because they know that that's the least effective. So we need to do our part to really advance this prevention agenda with alcohol. No level of alcohol is safe. We will now pass on to the other presenters for the other presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Samuels, for a quite extensive and very inclusive example of the challenges that we face at a regional level, both Caribbean and America's level, of alcohol, and the specific things about alcohol and women. So we know that alcohol, ladies and gentlemen, we know that alcohol affects women differently, and that's really why we've put this webinar together, because we don't feel that there's enough discussion at a regional, a governmental, a CARICOM level of the harmful use of alcohol, especially around women. And so we're going to pass on now to Professor Simon Anderson, who is going to talk to us about the clinical consequence of alcohol use and abuse. He's going to talk to us today about the clinical consequences of alcohol use and abuse. Simon.
Thank you very much, Johan, for the introduction. And thank you, Alafia, for really setting the stage very elegantly with respect to the current status of alcohol use and abuse in the Caribbean and globally. So I'll speak a little bit on the clinical consequences of alcohol use and abuse. I will say up front that it's a very wide area, and so not every specific detail can be gone into for this. Now, alcohol is a toxic and psychoactive substance with dependence-producing propensities. Its consumption, as we've heard, contributes to over 3 million deaths each year globally, as well as to disabilities and poor health in millions of people. And overall, its harmful use is responsible for around 5% of the global burden of disease. And clinically, it's associated with suicides, violence, as we've heard before, injuries, and so from the medical point of view, epilepsy, a very large proportion of liver cirrhosis, clinically, mouth cancers, pancreatitis, tuberculosis, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and hypertensive heart disease. The harmful use is accountable in women specifically for around 2% of the burden globally. And it is the leading factor, as we've heard, for premature mortality in the young, 15 to 49, and in the disadvantaged, especially in vulnerable populations that have higher rates of alcohol deaths. There's a conceptual causal model for alcohol consumption and health outcomes. And this one was adapted from a Nature Review paper. And the important thing to note is that the magnitude of health, social, and economic consequences experienced by the drinkers themselves, by other individuals, and society at large is influenced not only by the quantity or volume of alcohol, but also the way in which it's consumed. And individual and societal factors, including the policies and regulations, have a large influence on the type and magnitude of the problems associated with alcohol. There's clearly a relationship that is complex, and the literature on the health effects is dominated by observational rather than experimental studies, as well as meta-analyses, and the bulk of the evidence shows a consistent dose-response relationship that has led to causation being established through comparative risk assessment. I'll share with you some information from the Global Status Report, and estimates from 2016 includes non-communicable diseases such as digestive and cardiovascular diseases and cancer. And these are the priority areas in the region that needs to be focused on. Now, I'm going to make a list of the causes of death and disability causally related to alcohol consumption. And they can be divided into detrimental and sometimes beneficial, which is termed at low alcohol consumption. However, a recent paper coming out in the Lancet suggests that at no level is it safe, based on the ways in which the studies had estimated their findings. However, it's been consistently and causally associated with alcoholic gastritis, with its impact on acute and chronic pancreatitis, on the development of progressive liver diseases through advanced cirrhosis and other complications. It also is associated with esophageal varices, and there's a relationship between increasing average daily consumption and the incidence of cirrhosis, which is a major factor, and pancreatitis. There's also a range of neuropsychiatric conditions which are directly attributable to heavy alcohol use, including the alcohol dependence syndrome, including alcohol withdrawal states, alcohol myopathy, and alcohol-related brain injuries. It has it is well established as a component cause in cardiac arrhythmias, hypertensive disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke, with increased risk generally seen for the very high levels of consumption. Okay, the levels that are low to moderate are considered to be mixed evidence. And in terms of the percentages, as you can see, the greatest percentages lie around digestive disorders, followed by injuries and cardiovascular disease. Alafia mentioned a little bit about alcohol and gender-based violence and infectious disease, and all these three things are closely correlated. According to some work by UNDP, the harmful use of alcohol is closely linked to increased risk of sexual violence against women, girls, and men. Its abuse lowers inhibitions and increased risk-taking behavior. For example, having unprotected sex, or becoming more vulnerable to sexual coercion and sexual violence. And it also causes poor adherence to medical treatments and increases, of course, liver problems. And as a clinician, most medications that are taken are actually metabolized in the liver first before it is then has this active agent that goes around the body. And therefore, if you have the main metabolic center being damaged, then you'll have decreased efficacy of the treatment that you have, that the patient is taking. And of course, living with an infectious disease has extreme stigma and discrimination associated with it. And of course, you end up having increased alcohol consumption as a coping mechanism for depression, etc. So, I mean, it's a very close relationship in terms of infectious disease. Harmful use of alcohol affects the immune system. Chronic alcohol abuse results in immunodeficiency and liver damage that may also be partly triggered by alcohol-induced immunity. And various papers have shown higher rates of infectious illnesses such as pneumonia in situations where harmful alcohol use is prevalent. I'll show you here a little in vitro and in vivo studies which demonstrate that ethanol modulates the function of these are innate immune cells, the monocyte, the dendritic cell, T lymphocytes, and B lymphocytes. And alcohol modulates the function of these innate immune cells in a dose and time dependent manner. And these can be quite acute high dose exposures which inhibit long-term treatments and stimulate pro-inflammatory production. In addition, from in vivo studies, consumption of moderate amounts enhances phagocytosis and reduces the inflammatory cytokine productions, and chronic consumption of large doses inhibits the phagocytosis and the production of growth factors. And all the factors that you see here, the IL-6s, the apoptosis, are important aspects of health, and these have been shown to be inhibited by consumption of alcohol. Alafia showed a slide similar to this. The 7 types of cancers linked with alcohol: bowel, esophageal, the food pipe, the larynx, the voice box, mouth cancers, the upper throat, breast in women, and liver. And there's also mounting evidence that heavy drinking might be linked to pancreatic cancer. But how and why is still being worked out. But if you look on the panel on your right, it describes the features and the mutational landscape of DNA damage, which is caused by one of the key intermediaries in alcohol, the process of alcohol change to energy. And acetaldehyde is an endogenous alcohol. It's an alcohol-derived metabolite. Alcohol is broken down and converted into energy, and it is this acetaldehyde that is the center of the chain, and it is essentially the weakest link. It damages a DNA, double-stranded breaks, that despite the body trying to repair, it causes rearrangements in chromosomes, and therefore is thought to be the reason why cancer cells are formed. So this is the clear link between alcohol, its byproduct, and the cancers that are mentioned here. I'm going to share some data from a study of the UK Million Women study on alcohol drinking patterns and liver cirrhosis. This study included women recruited between 1996 and 2001. They were born between 1935 and 1950, and the study included 1 in every 4 UK women born within that time. In 2001, participants reported their alcohol intake, whether or not the consumption was with meals, or the number of days that it was consumed. What the study found was that, and this is a prospective study with a long follow-up, it permitted detailed examination of cirrhosis risk in relation to the amount of alcohol consumed. And if you look at all the 3 panels, along the axis, which we call the x-axis, you see the increase 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. That's the alcohol consumption in grams per week. And along the y-axis, is a risk of having liver cirrhosis. As is expected, risk of cirrhosis increases with the amount of alcohol consumed. And in the study, they controlled for the amount consumed and found that the excess risk of cirrhosis was consistently lower who drank alcohol, for example, with meals, and separately in women who drank wine only and versus other drinkers. So among women who drank 7 or more alcoholic drinks per week, the excess risk of cirrhosis was greater with daily consumption than with less frequent consumption. So overall, drinking daily was associated with a doubling of risk. I think I had a slide out of place, but the point we were making, and this is it's the same impact with cirrhosis. Actually, it's the same mechanism of acetaldehyde, which is then causing cancer by damaging DNA. It also affects hormonal levels, such as estrogen and insulin, and of course, it increases absorption, which makes it easier for other carcinogens to be absorbed. Alcoholic liver disease, therefore, in women is a warning of a silent danger. And in part, it's because, as I mentioned before, that women have a different way of metabolizing alcohol and have more, and therefore have more problems with that. So there are factors that that contribute to alcohol-related liver disease, and part of it has to do with increased gut permeability and the increase in endotoxins which move from the gut and go into the liver. This causes inflammatory and changes in cell activation, direct effects on the liver cells, which are called hepatocytes. And these effects are common in both men and women, but the experimental evidence shows that in women, the contribution is such that they have increased susceptibility to alcoholic liver disease. And there's still a substantial gap in why women are more susceptible to disease than men. And it is thought that some of these sex-related differences in expression might be related to some of the key metabolizing enzymes, such that an equivalent dose of alcohol results in a higher blood ethanol level in women than in men. Okay, let's share some insights on cardiovascular disease. As mentioned, a high burden is excessive drinking in its various forms is associated with cardiovascular disease, and this is a well-established phenomenon. The significant consumption of alcohol is associated with arrhythmias, including conditions called atrial fibrillation. And in fact, what tends to happen in some age groups is that after a binge drink session or reasonable amount of alcohol drink, the next day is followed by palpitations and irregular heartbeat. It's also associated with high blood pressure, and that then leads to increased size of the left ventricle. Hypertension is linked to obstructive sleep apnea, and of course, all of this leads to a big heart, which we term cardiomyopathy. There's clear increased risk of hemorrhagic types of stroke, such as cerebral hemorrhage and subarachnoid hemorrhages, and it may be responsible. Hypertension is a risk factor for these conditions, and alcohol may be responsible for about 16% of hypertensive disease, with the incidence of hypertension increasing by about 40% if one consumes more than 14 standard drinks per week. Recent data from the risk thresholds for alcohol consumption, which combined analysis of over 500,000 current drinkers in around 83 countries, have shown from this analysis here, these are for the various subtypes of cardiovascular disease, which I have which is on the left, including strokes, MIs, heart failure, arrhythmias, hypertensive disease, sudden cardiac death, and aneurysm. And on this line here is a line of unity. We call it the line of unity. And what you notice is that on the bottom scale here, which is the x-axis, higher risk of disease with higher alcohol consumption and lower risk of disease with higher alcohol consumption. There is some evidence of myocardial infarction and non-fatal MI being associated with higher levels of alcohol consumption. But in general, overall, that risk is probably taken away if there's also presence of hypertensive disease, arrhythmias, and so on. And this just zeroes in a little bit on the associations of the usual alcohol consumption with all-cause mortality and an aggregate of cardiovascular disease in current drinkers. And if you look at each of the slide panels for stroke, MI, coronary disease, which excludes heart attacks or MIs, heart failure, and deaths from other types of cardiovascular disease, the study concludes that there's a clear and this is clear and unambiguous, that alcohol is a colossal global health issue, and small reductions in health-related harms at low levels of alcohol intake are outweighed by increased risk in other health-related harms, including cancer. And this study, the threshold for the lowest risk of all-cause mortality was about 100 grams per week. For summary, excessive alcohol use has associated short-term health risks, including injuries, violence, alcohol poison, risky sexual behavior, and as we'll hear about miscarriages and stillbirth later on. It is in the long term associated with high blood pressure, cancers of the breast, mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, and colon, in learning and memory problems, in mental health problems, social problems, and dependence. In women's health, it disrupts the mental health cycle, increases the risk of infertility, and increase the likelihood of unprotected sex and sexually transmitted diseases. And finally, it has impact on the brain. Women are more vulnerable, impact on the heart, and big cancer risk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Anderson, for a really comprehensive study presentation. We're running a little bit behind time, so we want to move quickly into the final presentation today, which will be given to us by Dr. Stephanie Date, who's our consultant for the Healthy Caribbean Coalition Caribbean Alcohol Day 2019. So I'm going to ask Stephanie to present now. She's going to talk about pregnant women never drink alone, pregnancy and alcohol. This is, again, to look at the very important and under-discussed issue in Caribbean, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Stephanie, please proceed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maharaj. Now, although I'm not an expert in alcohol in women, I, as you mentioned, have a passion for public health, and especially as it relates to women in the Caribbean. So thank you for all being here today to listen to this presentation. Now, I'm just going to be touching on the epidemiology, as well as the impact, and focusing a little bit about fetal alcohol syndrome and how we might evaluate and manage the use of alcohol among women. So just to start, here are some statements surrounding this topic, and they're either true or false, and I want you to just have a look at them, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you can see if your guesses are correct. So there is a safe concentration of alcohol use in pregnancy. Alcohol can be safely consumed during particular times in pregnancy. Certain types of alcohol can be safely consumed in pregnancy, and the WHO region of the Americas has one of the lowest levels of fetal alcohol syndrome resulting from drinking. Now, commonly when we think about alcohol use, we link it to the 40-week gestational period, but as my colleagues just announced, it's actually starting its impact prenatally because it's associated with engagement in unprotected sex. This then causes an increased risk of experiencing unintended pregnancies, and also causes a delayed recognition of said pregnancy, which then causes an increased risk of fetal exposure to alcohol. And as we know, alcohol is a teratogen and can cause abnormalities when exposed in pregnancy. Just to touch briefly on the epidemiology, I know it was discussed a little bit earlier, but this image is taken from one of our HCC card infographics, and it shows that the systematic review and meta-analysis estimated a 9.8% prevalence of alcohol use in pregnancy globally, so almost 10% prevalence rate globally, and 0.2 to 13.9% prevalence rate of binge drinking was estimated. In terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, we can see here some familiar places. Far right, we notice that the region of the Americas, as stated, has about a 3% estimated rate in 2012, according to the meta-analysis. And on our far left, we have Paraguay at 14%. The median, however, as you see in the middle, is about 2% in countries such as Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Belize. So how about the impact? Now, I've mentioned that alcohol is a teratogen and that drinking in pregnancy is prevalent. Now, some adverse pregnancy outcomes can include stillbirth, premature birth, low birth weight, and I put a star next to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders because I don't think we can have a presentation on this topic without touching a little bit more on that. Just to go through quickly the pathophysiology and how exactly alcohol is going to be causing these harmful effects. So the fetus, as we know, is attached to the placenta by the umbilical cord. The placenta is allowing all the exchange of nutrients and oxygen and waste from mum to baby. But of course, that also does not exclude alcohol. So alcohol is polar and it's very small in size, and therefore it's easily diffused from mummy to the fetus. Now, just to look at this diagram, we have alcohol entering the fetal circulation. And alcohol, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, causes an increase of these substances called reactive oxygen species. And also, it causes a harmful chemical known as acetaldehyde, one of the harmful end products of metabolism of alcohol. This causes DNA and proteins and ultimately cell death to occur. Now, the fetal liver lacks important antioxidants. So normally in a healthy adult human, we might be able to combat the action of these free radicals, but the fetus's liver is lacking these antioxidants. It doesn't have the enzymes that help break down the harmful end products of alcohol metabolism. And essentially, oxygen species can end up overwhelming cellular repair. So this diagram just kind of summarizes it, and we end up having damage to fetal neurons because the brain, as we know, uses the highest amount of oxygen, and the fetal brain is very susceptible to this damage. So just to summarize, a woman will drink alcohol, it passes freely through the placenta. Within an hour or two, the fetus actually has a blood alcohol concentration nearly equivalent to the mother's alcohol concentration. This fetus has minimal ability to metabolize this alcohol, and it actually ends up almost living in this amniotic fluid reservoir of alcohol, because the amniotic fluid retains alcohol, which then prolongs the fetal exposure time to the same alcohol concentration. This just kind of shows that the risk of the adverse effects is related to not only the frequency of how often the mum is drinking, but the amount and the volume of alcohol the mum drinks while she's pregnant, as well as some genetic, maternal, and health and environmental factors as well. I want you to pay close attention to this red bar at the bottom that states there is no safe amount, no safe time, and no safe type of alcohol to drink during pregnancy. Some might say that certain trimesters are safer than others, but if you look at this diagram, it's just to show you that we know that the effects of alcohol exposure during stages of brain development is basically occurring throughout the entire gestational period. So yes, different things might be affected at different times, but there's really no safe time for a woman to drink alcohol in pregnancy. So just moving along quickly, I'd want to touch briefly on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And essentially, it's an umbrella term that encompasses all of these other disorders. And they all have one thing in common, and that is that CNS damage, central nervous system damage, is what occurs. One here that I want to touch on very briefly is a fetal alcohol syndrome. Here are some clinical features, and there's no universally accepted set of diagnostic criteria, but normally the diagnosis centers on prenatal alcohol exposure, and 2 or 3 of the features you can see on these slides, mainly facial dysmorphisms, such as a thin upper lip, short palpebral fissures, and a smooth filtrum. Just to touch quickly on epidemiology. So what does fetal alcohol syndrome look like globally? The GSR report on alcohol and health last year shows us here in the second bar, the Americas, blue being fetal alcohol syndrome, had a 16.6% prevalence rate per 10,000 people. But if you look to the far right, that's actually greater than the 14.6% prevalent rate in the world. So it's actually higher. This is another image taken from one of our infographics that just kind of illustrates this. So globally, we have prevalence rate per 10,000, and the Americas has a 16.6% prevalence rate. Here, this just shows our Latin America and Caribbean estimates in 2012. You see Trinidad and Tobago on the far right lower end, and Grenada and Haiti are on the left at higher prevalence rates of these fetal alcohol syndrome disorders. Risk factors for this disorder: not only do you have to have drinking in pregnancy, but it also occurs more commonly in women who are older, have higher gravity, who are poorer, and have also had previous children with this disorder as well. I just want to touch very quickly on breastfeeding because I don't think I can have a presentation without mentioning this. And essentially, breast milk alcohol levels actually closely parallel blood alcohol levels. Usually, alcohol levels are highest in breast milk about half an hour to an hour after a mother consumes the same beverage. And just to summarize and finish off, to evaluate alcohol use and alcohol in women, given that CNS damage from prenatal alcohol exposure is permanent, there's no actual cure for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. The best treatment is, of course, prevention. Prevention is the responsibility of all healthcare workers, including nurses, pharmacists, and clinicians should be fully aware that this is 100% preventable. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommend we screen all women, and this is one of these screening tools you can use. A couple of them, such as the ASSIST and the CERT-P, which is a substance use risk profile in pregnancy, can be used to screen women for alcohol use. And of course, policymakers and media play a huge role in educating the public on the harmful use of alcohol in pregnancy. And I've just put this image here from a charity in Ireland, and two of the warning labels I came across are Albania's "drinking can harm your unborn baby" and Kenya's "alcohol consumption when pregnant harms your baby." When I was looking up different labels, I did find some that are used in the UK in the far right corner, "Know Your Limits," as well as a diagram showing that pregnancy and drinking do not mix on the bottom left, and one that's actually found in some bars in the United States. However, when I was looking at warning labels and policy on drinking in women, I found this article that was published this year by the New York Times that actually states that warning pregnant women not to drink can actually backfire. And to combat alcohol use, 43 states started to actually, they enacted policies. These included affirmative measures, they gave pregnant women more priority for substance abuse, and they defined drinking alcohol during pregnancy as actually being child abuse or neglect. This actually led to less women coming forward and seeking care, and there was an increase of 12,000 preterm births that they believe is linked to these women drinking alcohol. So just this quote at the bottom, it's easy to stigmatize women who drink during pregnancy with words and with policy. The goal, though, as Dr. Samuels actually mentioned, is healthier mothers and infants, and to achieve this, policymakers may need to stop stigmatizing and start all over again. So to close, just to touch back on our true or false statements, there is a safe concentration of alcohol use in pregnancy. Most people might say no, there isn't, but for me, I say yes. That concentration is 0 grams. That's the safest concentration. Alcohol can be safely consumed during particular times. No, that is false, as we just saw. It affects every trimester. Certain types of alcohol can be safely consumed. Again, no type of alcohol gets away. And the WHO region is actually the second highest level of fetal alcohol syndrome resulting from drinking in pregnancy. So I thank you very much, and I just want to leave you with this quote: prenatal alcohol exposure, no safe amount, no safe time, and no safe alcohol, period. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie, for a very, very focused and very careful presentation. I think that really sets us to one of the key reasons why we've had a focus on women's health this year, women and alcohol. In our region, about 5% of our young people end up having learning disabilities. One of our studies recently suggests as many as 30% of women involved during the preconception period, these are women between 18 and 45, are using alcohol without knowing the effects of how this may affect a pregnancy or a future pregnancy. So this is really something that we really have to pay attention to. And if you look around our region, there are very few public health messages that are reaching out to women, trying to educate them and prepare them with this. Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor. Thank you for putting up the infographics. So if any of you have not received the infographics, please attend the HCC webpage, or you can send a message to any of us on the moderators, and we will forward to you our infographics for women and alcohol. Please disseminate them widely, put them in your health centers in all the areas where you work, send them to your friends, and use the information that we have here. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor now for maybe 2 questions. Please identify yourself, and you can just raise your hand and I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, Rohan. This is Maisha. I'm not sure there are any questions. I don't see any. We can ask Ian to check.
Okay. So would you or Sutra would like to just have a few closing comments, Maisha?
I think just before we close, it would be helpful if Stephanie would go through the key messages just really quickly, because I think that's important, the key messages that we have for CARD this year. And perhaps you could go back to the key messages slide, Ian, and Stephanie can just rattle those off really quickly, and then we can wrap up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. So just to summarize the key messages. So alcohol affects men and women differently, giving rise to unique gender-based vulnerabilities, as we mentioned. And this year we thought it was very important to touch on alcohol and women, and I hope this webinar has shown you why that was important. Now, alcohol metabolism occurs differently in women due to differences in their body structure and their chemistry, and that leads to greater absorption of alcohol as well as delayed excretion. Now, for the same amount of alcohol consumed by women as compared to men, women will have an exponential increase actually, in risk of injury, including road injuries. Now, responses to men and women drinking reflect broader gender norms. While drinking by men is used as an excuse for their behavior, women who drink are judged more harshly for their behavior or their appearance. Now, drinking alcohol increases men and women's risk of liver and cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and assault. However, women are additionally impacted by alcohol use and breast cancer. Now, women are also impacted when they become pregnant, as I had discussed, and during pregnancy, alcohol will increase their risk of miscarriage, stillbirth, premature deliveries, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. There's no completely safe level of alcohol consumption, and no alcohol should be consumed by pregnant women at any time. Gender inequalities are intrinsically linked to alcohol consumption and problems, and women face greater barriers to access health services as compared to men. Closing, the alcohol industry is increasingly targeting women through gender-specific design and packaging, and the pervasive and persuasive marketing strategies. The absolute number of currently drinking women has risen worldwide, and women are starting to actually drink at a younger age. Alcohol use is a cultural norm throughout the Caribbean region, being readily available and inexpensive, and regulating alcohol availability and affordability will reduce the gender inequalities in the Caribbean. Women are bearing both economic and social burden of alcohol use by their family members and male partners, and women need to raise their voices and advocate towards alcohol policies at all levels of decision making. Reducing alcohol consumption can be achieved by implementing WHO's Safer Technical Package, which, as the last thing I will mention, you should encourage your kids to abstain from the use of alcohol. You should lead by example, to advocate against the promotion of free or below-cost alcoholic beverage, question messages on responsible drinking as they are misleading and unclear. Please advocate for banning all forms of alcohol marketing, including those targeting women in particular, and erase the stigma surrounding alcohol use disorder. Abstain and gain. Abstinence is the best choice to make. If you drink alcohol, drink less, and if you don't drink, don't start. Thank you so much.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for those very powerful words to close us off. I want to thank everybody who has been here today. We've had great participation. Please collect the infographics, disseminate them widely, put them up in your offices, put them up into your health centers, wherever you work, send it to friends and to family, and try to put these things into your life. I noticed that about 2/3 of our participants today were women. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you very much. So Trevor, Maisha, and the team, Ian, and everyone else, Alafia and Simon for your participation, and Stephanie for being our coordinator for this year.